instead that there is this part of the movement that for over 100 years has just devoted itself to the task of national identity and national mourning and contemplation. I mean, it really does feel like a space to think about the history we have and the history we want. So I think it's a strange time to be someone like Ron and to do this kind of work, but I would encourage all of you, if you've never been to one. I mean, I think the reason, Garrett, you and I have that reaction, I cry sometimes thinking about the visit I made with Ron to New Bern National Cemetery, which is down in North Carolina. And actually I was there and got to meet the article I wrote about Ron begins with this repatriation effort of actually an unidentified grave from Normandy brought home to North Carolina. And again, to the point of things we don't have to do. This was a gunner with almost no living family. A niece who'd never met him was actually the reason he was identified and brought home. And yet the veterans groups met him with this elaborate heroes parade, and the cemetery buried him as if he were a 4-star general. Talk about egalitarianism. It really doesn't matter what rank you held. It really doesn't matter whether you were a coward or distinguished yourself in some sort of extraordinary way. If you served your country, you were entitled to the same um, experience in death, and that's truly remarkable. It's unlike, and you go and you walk around France, and I love the times I've visited France. It's a wonderful country. I've had wonderful visits, but you go and you see these monuments, and it's General so and so and his men, and his men is the entirety of the rest of the effort. And in the United States, you go and you walk, and 4-star generals are there alongside privates. So that's Ron, and that's the work he does. And I think he's, there are all sorts of strategic reasons I think Ron was nice to include in this book. And another one of those is, of course, plenty of people who do not identify as beneficiaries of the government's work have relatives buried in these cemeteries, desire to be buried there themselves, or think this is the sort of thing the government could be doing. And here we are doing it so well that we put lie to the stereotype of the bureaucrat. So I love that about Ron, and it was fun to get to write about him and fun to get to think about management. I manage no one. I mean, actually, I manage 2 people. One is 3.5 years old. The other is 3 months. I do a terrible job of it. So I was almost late today. So fun to think about, teams and leadership and management. Because again, the private sector spends billions of dollars a year on morale boosting and team building and yada yada yada. And here's Ron with no budget at all, actually raising people up, making them care about their work. He has a large number of veterans in his employ, but not all, getting the rest of them to sign up for VA mission. And so just all around the edges of this story about American identity are just these really great leadership lessons and management lessons. So that's why it was fun to write about Ron. I say there's a funny line in the piece where I say Ron is obsessed with measurement. The reason he's so good at pursuing excellence is he's relentlessly self-scrutinizing. And I'll tell you all one thing that just doesn't make it into the piece. There's a tiny bit of first person, but I say something about like if you want to become more physically fit, you should like count your steps. And literally the day I left Ron, I was like, oh, I've always wanted to do the 10,000 step thing. Turn on the step counter. Other than like 2 weeks postpartum, have kind of gotten those steps thanks to Ron. So if you're not already interested in Ron's story, I swear you will decide to do something in your own life better if you spend a few minutes thinking about Ron. So forget that I wrote it, but just the reason I'd recommend Ron's chapter of the book is truly it will improve your life. It will be better than any reel or TED talk you've seen recently. You will walk away from Ron thinking, I want to be better at something. I want to be better at, responding to my voicemails, talking to my mother, getting exercise, whatever it is, personal or professional. He's just actually inspirational.
Let me ask you one more question about this project, and then I'm going to bring Max up to have a little bit of a broader conversation here. Uh, you are not someone who has spent your career reporting on the government, covering the federal workforce. I wonder if you could talk a little bit just about what you feel like you came away from this reporting learning about the federal government, and then talk a little bit similarly about the reaction to this book, which I've lost track. You have probably, it's 5 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list, 7 weeks, maybe longer, maybe less.
In between
Yeah.
there. The point is people are hungry for it.
Yeah.
It's not that we did a great job. People are desperate for these kinds of stories. I cannot tell you, on the one hand, the events I've been a part of, are filled with people who've lost their jobs or know someone who has. And so there is some sadness and melancholy and anxiety. But they're also just desperately filled with people who, I don't want to put a partisan label on it. They're not only liberal, they're not only progressive. Some of them are centrist or conservative, but they are champions of this country and of the government, and they actually believe government can and does good work. And they are desperate for stories. And I don't want to trivialize this, but they want something they can take to a cocktail party. They want something they can like post on Facebook for their annoying brother. They want something that they're tired of their yard sign, and they very much want stories they can share. And again, I don't want to trivialize this, that sounds, or instrumentalize the work you all do and the work that you all lift up, but I cannot tell you, they want someone like Ron, so that when they get into an argument about Doge, they have an actually specific and concrete example. And maybe Ron is useful because they're talking to a certain kind of person, but they want to know, the specific part of the government that makes their community better because they're certain it exists. But they don't want to have to do any research or reporting. Why should they? That's my job, possibly your job. I'm trying to think if I had written about the federal government. I wrote a profile of Deb Haaland, the former Secretary of Interior. But prior to that, had I written, I guess I wrote an article about some municipal employees in Baltimore. Do any of you live in Baltimore? Okay, I wrote about the guys who make the salt boxes. Baltimore has these iconic salt boxes that I was interested in, and there's a really wonderful team at the Department of Transportation who build this, and they're clever and interesting guys. But no, I hadn't. Forget a beat or expertise. Again, you got the worst of the writers. I have no beat. I have no expertise. Forget federal government. I guess I write often about religion, but in any event, no, the idea here was actually I am an American citizen, so of course I know something about the government. Of course I benefit. I got to go to college because of a FAFSA form. I grew up in a rural community that had 4-H because of USDA and the Cooperative Extension Service. I went to public schools, so the Department of Education, despite everything you've heard, had a hand in making sure there were standards and guidelines. And when I wanted to go to college, I had a legible transcript that could be compared to other institutions of learning around this country. So I think in a really good way, what Michael decided to do is say, actually, this is important work for all of us. And actually, it does not require expertise. Expertise can help you appreciate some of the finer work of the government. I met one of the NIST teams last year who won a Sammy for their work around tornado standards. There is, of course, expert and important and arcane work that the government does, but the beautiful thing about it is so much. Even that benefits communities in a way that should be legible and intelligible to the average American. So no, I think the worst thing to think would be like, oh, you have to follow the Fed to have an opinion about monetary policy. I would like to think that people advising the Fed have expertise, but the rest of us can certainly think about interest rates and look around and drill into, or Michael's example from the Fifth Risk, if you haven't read it, is the National Weather Service and NOAA. And there's just every day. So I see one of you picking up your phone. You're bored out of your mind at what I'm saying. It's fine. I totally understand it. Open your weather app. Why does it work? Why is it free? There are all sorts. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I actually saw someone else picking up their phone, but no, it's like, why do our phones have internet on them? I mean, again, do not see the narrative that the government does great things. Please don't. It's such an easy thing to do. It's such a cynical time. I think what's dangerous is so much of the world tells us to be embarrassed by any, you heard me say I'm a patriot. I think there have been huge efforts to erode this sense of identity in this country. And pride is a complicated thing, but a complex pride about who we are as a nation and what we can do and how we can do it better has somehow become a fear of saying we've done anything well or that we've accomplished anything. So I think it's so, so, so important. And again, th- the only thing more despised in this country than the government is the media. So by all means, realize that we cannot do this task alone. I, in my day job, work for the New Yorker, and I love the New Yorker, but you know, sometimes I go and knock on a door and I say I write for the New Yorker magazine. Most of the time, people haven't heard of it. Um, a small number of times they've heard of it, and they can hear is the New York part of it, and they despise it, and they don't want to talk to me, or they assume the worst about who I am and what I might have to say about their life or the story I'm writing. But that's all to say we're as marginalized as the federal government, and I think it would be awful to think, oh, I can only pitch a story to the Washington Post. I love the Post. The Post was a wonderful repository for these stories, but if you are only depending on the Post or Roll Call or Politico to talk about the work you're doing, you have already marginalized your position. Again, I think a wonder people keep asking me why we wrote a book and why we're not just doing Instagram stories or like Twitter posts. And on the one hand, that makes me despair for the future of the printed word. On the other hand, they're exactly right. Actually a 30-second video where you just talk about your job or again, the job of someone is tremendously important. And the landscape of storytelling in this country is kind of, I don't want to sound alarmed by it. In some ways, it's just beautifully discursive now. You really do have a community of people who only care about, fish and wildlife. So if you work for fish and wildlife or forestry, go talk to that podcast. Go post on that social media page of like actually the fly fishermen who are really, really upset about, water conditions in some obscure part of Yellowstone or something. Talk to them. Do not wait for the New York Times to do a 1,000-word feature on your work. Talk to the local newspaper where the salmon fishery is based, and that's the only other thing I would say. And at every one of these events, I have said it, and Max is going to look at me and say, but I pitched you a story and you didn't do it. I was on maternity leave. I had a baby in January, but I'm very serious about reporters are incredibly lazy. They are incredibly myopic about what they write about. They're often reading other things to figure out what they should write about. Another way you shouldn't be bashful is write to the reporter. Casey, you read something by Casey Cep about Ron Walters and you work for, I don't know, you work for NIST or something. Write to me and say, I have a great story. Chances are, if I don't want to write it or I can't write it, I will take it to an ideas meeting at the New Yorker. Garrett knows plenty of people who are desperate for ideas too. It's not always a fit. Sometimes, you have to figure out a different way to tell it, but quite often it's just we haven't heard about it. And we haven't heard about it because no other media outlet has written about it. And there are fewer and fewer of those to kind of kick stories up the food chain. But do not be bashful about sending the note. I assure you, if I open my phone right now, for the last week, somebody who manufactured, I have never once in my life, I think, written about recreational games, but I swear for the last month, once a week, I've been getting pitched on Pop Darts, which I'm not advertising to you, but it's some kind of game for children in the backyard where I'm like, God bless the publicist who really thinks if she emails me again, I am going to write about Pop Darts. But I'm telling you, these people in the private sector have relentless PR machines and they employ many, many people. And it's wonderful. Sometimes there is a match. On the other hand, someone writes to me about a beautiful book I wouldn't have otherwise heard of. But, be the PR person for the work you believe in. I'm sure that's why you went to work for the government. You believe that work is important. Go tell a journalist about it. And that email, you don't have to write the article for them. It would help if you did. Here are the 3 people I think you should talk to. There's an academic at the University of Maryland. Think about the stories you read and how they're shaped. There's like a beneficiary, there's an expert, and there's an employee. You can help do that work. But I assure you, journalists are just as busy and besieged as you are. So actually helping with the idea is a wonderful thing to do. And again, no guarantees, and you might not get the story you want, which is the terrifying part for people who've worked in PR. Maybe suddenly I get interested in Pop Darts, but it turns out there's all sorts of safety issues, and instead the article is about how you should never buy Pop Darts for your godchildren or something like that, or your community pool. But I can assure you there are so many journalists just waiting to hear from you. And maybe you make the social media post and then you say, oh, I wrote about this and 1,000 people told me stories about the Social Security Administration. And that makes it even more appealing because they can go and but the reason they're writing about the dross and, the internecine fightings on X is because those stories are right in front of their eyeballs. They're going to write about Elon Musk until kingdom come because no one else has come along to say this is a more interesting and important story. And they're going to write about the kind of easiest political bantering and politicking of the day because the harm from what's going on from Doge is a little harder to approximate, a little harder to estimate. And anything you can do to help with that just makes it more likely that those stories will get into the world. So yeah, I mean, Ron, it's so funny because again, Ron would never do this. It's not like I wrote about Ron because Ron raised his hand to be like, please write about me. In fact, every day he was like, please don't do this, reconsider. But yeah, I just think you probably all underestimate the appetite journalists have for stories and probably overestimate the degree to which autonomy has shaped the news you read. I don't want to disparage my colleagues or make it sound like we're only transcriptionists, but quite often you're reading a story because someone outside of the news making institution suggested we write about it and helped shape it and helped craft it. And to demystify that process, there's just, no amount, and it doesn't have to be self-promotion. Again, I see you all like having an allergic reaction. I already see people who are like, oh, I could never do this. It doesn't have to be self-promotion. It could be, I work for this agency. I work for, there was a version of this, which is I work for NCA. You've probably never heard of it, but we maintain the national cemeteries. And I think you would, and again, write to a Garrett, oh, I loved your book on Watergate. I wish you would write about this other thing. People suggest wonderful stories to me all the time. They suggest terrible stories to me all the time. I most often write back, whether they're good, terrible, or in between. So I have a contact form. Most journalists do, or write to the news agency and say, I love so and so's work. Could you send this email along? And it's very much worth doing. I can't be, I mean, you ran a magazine. How many ideas came from publicists or PR people? And, it's just, I can't begin to tell you how worth doing it is. And maybe you start with the Facebook post first and then send that along. But that is truly how the sausage gets made.
Let me bring Max up to ask him a couple questions here, and I'll sort of give him a long windup question-wise to give him a chance to get up here. And the thing that I would just add to Casey's point is feel free to also do this on Signal if you prefer to not do this from your government email.
Oh, right. Please don't get fired in your effort to, yes. Yeah. Put a piece of mail in the USPS, without your name, signature, or identified printer marks. Yes. If you have a more, I'm thinking of the kind of good stories of, but yes, if you have an urgent,
stories,
yeah,
I think
yeah,
in this moment, depending on sort of where you are in government, one of the
to safe journalism. Yeah.
One of the weird things that has happened since January, totally coincidentally, is most journalists now list their Signal in their social media bio or contact page, and you should feel free to utilize that. Max, one of the things that Casey just said sort of struck me, and I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about it, which is on the one hand, sort of both of the Trump administrations have been these incredible civics lessons where there are all of these posts in government that in the normal day-to-day operations of the country, the ordinary American should never actually have to know the person who carries out that job. The most Americans should be able to live their entire life without ever knowing who the administrator of GSA is, or the director of OPM, or the postmaster general. And one of the real delights of the two Trump administrations is our ability to begin to pay incredibly close attention to the hour by hour decision making of the administrator of GSA, or these other obscure offices that we get to learn about in the Trump administration. And I wonder, I feel like we are sort of living through this moment right now where we have seen this incredible damage done to the foundations of the sort of nonpartisan career civil service in the last 107 days, um and yet are not as a nation feeling the cost of that yet. And I think you're sort of beginning to see it in these sort of small, tiny ways. The collapse of air traffic control at Newark Airport in the last week that sort of feel to those of us who have covered government for a long time, who sort of understand the federal bureaucracy, that these are the sort of leading edge of an incredible amount of sort of harm and damage that our country is going to face over the next couple of months, years, and in some cases decades. I think sort of part of the challenge that we are living through is we're watching some of these court processes take place, for instance, around USAID, but like USAID just doesn't exist anymore. And even if there is a court order that comes at some point that sort of sends everyone back to work, this is not like walking back into a factory and turning the lights on and the production machines just start back up and running. We're losing the expertise, we're losing the institutional memory. um how do you sort of think about this moment and the storytelling that we need at this moment to understand as a country what we're about to live through?
Okay, so that's a big question. I did want to just
In 75 words or
okay.
less.
Okay, but I did want to just take a moment and say how much I really appreciated your conversation around patriotism, around cemetery services, and really unpacking the sort of innate humility that exists in civil servants and the importance of pushing back against that. And I think this comes back to your question, Garrett, that I do think we're in a moment where there is an opportunity for our country to understand something that I actually think they should have been understanding all along. But it's only in absence that we might be able to get a broader swath of Americans to pay attention. I don't think it's a foregone conclusion. I think there is already substantial harm. You talked about your own observations in Burlington. We have had an entire sector of our economy wiped out, international development. As you said, it's not going to come back even if the courts do the right thing, because the relationships, the goodwill, the investments that are necessary to create what had existed took decades, to actually create. So I do think we have to fight on several fronts. One of which are events like this one, where we continue to highlight and talk about the good things that are occurring in government. So hopefully we're not only talking about loss. Secondly, I think it is fundamental for us to translate to specific communities, maybe Burlington, where you see the direct harm, what is actually being experienced by the people who live there because of the thoughtless cuts to government. Again, I think an element of this has to also be around the understanding that we can do better with government and we need to do better. What we're seeing today is in fact non-strategic and harmful, going in the exact opposite direction. So I don't think you can fight against a broader public expectation and desire for better in our government, but I think we can explain why the choices being made now are incredibly destructive to that for vision and to the quality of life and frankly the safety that we expect as Americans. So it is a battle over narrative. It's going to take, as Casey suggested, everyone sharing their stories, everyone looking for opportunities to be able to communicate across their own networks and beyond, ideally thinking about how this is relevant for place as well as for specific constituencies, and how to get into different channels. So that certainly mainstream media matters, but the social media footprint is certainly, I think, more and more important in terms of setting expectations of what people believe is true. And I think we have found in the research we've been doing for a number of years that story is incredibly powerful. We've seen this in work we've been doing ongoing for now 4 years, that the way you actually influence perception is through these stories. So, the who is government is powerful, and we need more.
And I wonder, uh, this is unfortunately like two people that I could spend like several hours with each individually. And I want to get a couple of audience questions in quickly, but let me ask you one more question here, and which is, what have you learned about why people come to government as join the government, join public service, and why do they stay?
Well, I think, and it's a question that I think is a question of optimism in my view. I think that people largely come to government because they care about purpose. And Michael, I think, has a very profound statement that one of the reasons why the stories that you and he and your colleagues told resonated so powerfully is that they represent for the reader an opportunity to see a life well led. And that, opportunity to demonstrate purpose in one's professional occupation is incredibly powerful. And in a lot of ways, what is so, on the flip side, so damning about what we're seeing done to the civil service and our government is that you're crushing, or in the words of this administration, traumatizing people who are there to serve the American public. And it is as true for those who serve in uniform as those that serve in the civil service, and so many of those are the same people. So that's extraordinary. But direct answer to your question, people come and they stay because they have an opportunity to fulfill that desire for helping others, to do it on the most impactful stage that we exist. Our government is our most important tool for collective action to deal with our biggest problems. And we have plenty of problems. So we need a government that is going to work effectively. I believe that as much harm is taking place today, because our government represents such an extraordinary, opportunity to serve in a meaningful way, that rebuilding is going to be possible. I think it requires and starts with leaders who fundamentally understand that our government is there for the public good rather than their private interests, and who fundamentally understand that their role as leaders is to run an institution and to care for an institution and not simply announce policy, which is much of what we've had across both parties for a very, very long time. But if we are able to pick leaders that have that understanding, then I think we can turn this around, and relatively quickly.
All right, let me open it up to an audience question or two, right here. And hold on, we have a mic coming for the people who are watching online.
Hi, I'm Amber McDonald. I am a former federal worker and a writer, a speechwriter. I think thinking about my colleagues, good government is often unseen. The things that they do every day are often, the small, simple, mundane things. For our friends here who want to tell that story, whether it's online or to a reporter, and they're listening to you and thinking, well, I didn't invent the Mars rover. I don't run a huge cemetery. How do you help them think through finding the profound in the mundane? How do you find that story to tell in a way that's compelling when you know that the work they're doing is so important, but they may describe it as I process forms or I do these day-to-day things? How do you think about finding that story in a way that is compelling and human?
Oh my gosh, the part of Ron's profile, and he cried telling me the story, and I've cried thinking about the story. So Ron runs the NCA. He's the highest ranking non-political appointee in NSA. But Ron told me a story about a literal landscaper at one of the NCA cemeteries. And the story goes like this. It was pouring down rain. He watched a woman getting out of her car in shoes she couldn't wear through the mud and the muck. And he took off his boots and went over and gave them to her so that she could get to a relative's grave. And, I love that story because that's not running a cemetery. That's not improving the budget of NCA. That's not fighting for cemetery expansion. It's literally something you can't put in the employee handbook. It's going above and beyond. And then he stood by this woman while she was at the graveside in the muck and the mud. And, for Ron, that's their employees. That is the story I want on the front page of every local newspaper. Not, I love Ron, but not middle management is doing really well, right? Actually, in the annals of inspiration, the managerial class has been subject to, a great amount of theorization, but rarely is lifted up as the what you should be and who you should aspire to be. I'm glad to have told Ron's story, but Ron's story is built on stories like that one. So I actually don't think, I think the opposite of scale is what's appropriate here. We have too many. I told you I wrote about Deb Haaland. She's an incredibly inspirational figure, but oh my gosh, in hindsight, I really missed, the forest for the trees here. Why did I write about the head of interior and not any number of interesting employees at the lower level? And actually, to Deb's credit, every time I met her, and I'm going to call her Deb because everybody does and the profile's done, and she's no longer Secretary of Interior, every moment I met with her, she was begging me to write about some other employee and the work that they were actually doing in some community. So I think the kind of reverse scale we're accustomed to is really important. And look, I mean, it turns out forms and awarding grants are really important. The two most effective anti-Doge things I've read were not in the Washington Post or this book or the New Yorker or the New York Times. One was in the weekly newsletter of my local public library. And they wrote about a part of the federal government I'd never heard of that administers grants for local libraries, including rural libraries like ours. And God bless them for not being bashful, for saying our funding is imperiled. It was not a partisan message, but it begged all of us who take our children to story hour and who use the Maryland room for researching local history or genealogy to realize that much of that funding was not our local tax dollars, but a federal grant. And the second most effective thing I've seen is Parnassus Books, which is a bookstore in Nashville, Tennessee, begging people to realize the Southern Festival of the Book, which is a book festival in Nashville, one of the best in the country, was free because of the National Endowment for the Humanities. And whatever you thought the NEH was doing, actually what it was doing was making it possible for your favorite children's book author or, the self-help author who changed your life to come to Nashville and sign books for you for free. And again, it was not partisan. It was transparent. It said, this will either go away or it will cost you money like everything else in this godforsaken world. You will not be able to afford it, or only those who can afford it will enjoy it. And there will be a VIP line. It will not be egalitarian like most things the federal government does. But that is thanks to a paper pusher at NEH. And I think they mentioned there's a curious book reviewing outlet in Tennessee, Chapter 16, which is it's a wonderful story. I'd actually written about it before, but I think they mentioned Chapter 16 too. But again, the wonderful specificity, it's not like the federal government is sending someone to hold the door open for you at the Nashville Public Library when you go to the Southern Festival of the Book, but the infrastructure and the ability to get it started is thanks to a paper pusher at NEH. So I think the paper pushing is a wonderful thing to talk about. And actually, in terms of government efficiency, we probably don't need a federal book festival coordinator, but we need someone at NEH who looks around and says, where are there book festivals? Where are there not? Is this one going to be open to the public? Is there any amount of feedback on, is it growing? Is it welcoming diverse communities? So I actually think those kinds of stories are really wonderful. Find the paper pusher and talk about the 20 things that they help funnel federal money into the community, because actually the federal government is an efficient way to redistribute resources. I don't want to sound like a communist, but it is, and it's a wonderful thing. And I would rather not have to research every nonprofit in Nashville, Tennessee to decide this is where I want to give $100 this year at Christmas when I'm working through my annual tithes. So those are the two. I'd be curious kind of from where you're sitting. I felt like one of those was an Instagram post someone sent me saying, gosh, they are fundraising to make up for the amount of money the book festival lost. And the other was the weekly newsletter where I thought, good for them. It wasn't just an events listing. It was okay, again, and I wish now, to the point of what I learned from this book, even, I swear, if you think you know about the federal government, you don't. 3 million people. It's up to a lot of things you've never heard of. I don't even remember the name of the agency that was handling local library grants, but for a brief moment, and in my postpartum brain, I think in some previous era, I would have retained it and spit out the acronym for you. But I can't. But there it was. And for a brief moment, I thought, oh gosh, I don't even think about the Talbot County Public Library being funded by federal dollars, but it is, and it should be. And there are plenty of institutions like it that wouldn't exist without it. But I'd be curious for you all, kind of what you're seeing. That's just to say it wasn't a 10,000 word profile about that part of the federal government. It was one paragraph written by a precocious librarian.
Institute of Museum and Library Sciences.
Thank you.
The,
Someone with the actual expertise. Give it to me again. Give me the
Institute
okay.
of
Someone here is like
Museum and Library
mortified. I
Sciences,
couldn't spit it out and didn't know it from birth, but
yeah.
so rural development. Yes. I mean, the unsung hero of where I live on the Eastern Shore of Maryland is rural development.
Yeah.
Talk about billions of dollars. People would be embarrassed to realize everything.
Yeah.
Everything about my life is improved
Yeah.
by federal dollars. And the people there, we're the one, I mean, whatever, I can talk about that part of the world. I love it. I was born and raised there, but there are so many people who need to be told how much of their life is improved by federal dollars because they're in total denial about it. But
yeah. And I think that's my sort of short answer to the question as well, is like, look at the end result, which, and at a very cynical level right now, I think what I live in Vermont, Casey lives in the Eastern Shore. It is the rural states and the rural places that are going to get hit the hardest, fastest by the cuts that we've seen and the damage that we've seen this winter. And I think trying to figure out how you tell the story of how, the red states actually get, cynically, a disproportionate benefit from federal government spending. And, the sort of weirdness of, and you see this in, congressional approvals, which is like, everyone hates Congress but loves their congressperson. Sort of really trying to break the story down to the local communities and the way that these tax dollars flow through institutions that Americans have never heard of, whether it's library sciences or USDA rural development or National Endowment for the Humanities. I think one of the sort of funny themes to me that comes out in Michael Lewis's Fifth Risk is like how basically like every part of the government is criminally misnamed. The Department of Energy is not what people think the Department of Energy does, and the Department of Agriculture is not really about agriculture in the way that people think it is, and the Department of Commerce actually has shockingly little to do with commerce. And that sort of thinking about how you localize and tell these stories in ways that people actually understand. And Fifth Risk, one of the characters in it is like the relatively young kid. I think he was in his sort of mid to late 20s at the time, who in the Obama administration becomes the OMB leader on USDA and realizes in sort of reading through the USDA budget that like basically his entire life has been underwritten by USDA and he had never heard it, from school lunches to rural development to food stamps to, on and on. And, he's now effectively in charge of the budget and realizing for the first time that like he would not be where he is today without that. We're already over time. It's Max's event, so I will look to Max to see if I have
your lead. So you're in charge.
maybe I'll take one more audience question and then let
one
people go.
tiny follow-up to that, which is so you reminded me USDA. I just feel like one of the other thing it's hard for us all to talk about, although we've had the kind of personal experience of like you know, you were slightly distracted and you almost got into an accident and you resolved to be a better driver. I just feel like the actual difficult story to tell about the federal government is all of the almost disasters. And that's the whole point of Michael's Fifth Risk, is like the government is saving your life, and because it did, you don't know it.
Yeah.
And food safety is the one that is just on my mind. And I have talked about this at a couple of events and feel like I know it well from my sister, but it's like the ability to go to the grocery store and buy the lettuce or the you know, fruit that doesn't give you hepatitis. I just think that is one where no matter where you live, no matter how rich you are, that infrastructure protects you every day, and it could do a better job. Again, one difficult part of this is not to say the government is perfect, it succeeds at everything, but that's one. I mean, and there are stories like that, all the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, all sorts of things where preventative work is being done, and those stories are just as important to tell too. And you don't have to have the catastrophe. Michael does a really good job of this. The last chapter of our book is Heather Stone at FDA. You know, it's like there's a child who lived and there's a child who died, and that depended entirely on the sharing of information about extremely rare medical disorders. So sometimes you can have the dramatic version of the government worked, the government did, this thing didn't exist, this thing did exist. But another kind of storytelling that is so important is the work that is keeping people safe, and it's the catastrophe averted. The other example in the book is Chris Mark at Department of Labor. Who knew? I've seen people respond to that story, not because they have relatives who are coal miners, but because they immediately understand a version of it that exists in some form of dangerous work or dangerous lifestyle. So I think, you know, again, you don't a kind of success that is hard to talk about, but that is urgently important with the government's work, is that kind of risk aversion work that happens across agencies, and is another kind of storytelling to lift up.
And I'll now add one thing to Casey adding something to my answer, which is I think the other thing that comes through in a lot of this work, and I think a story that government is bad at telling, is how recent so much of this is. That sort of the safety and security that the federal government and governments at all levels sort of underpin modern American life, sort of how recent all of that is. You know, the mine worker, you know, mine safety story that Michael Lewis tells, you know, the federal government did not have the ability to regulate mine safety until just before I was born. And, you know, it was the work that he did, that this guy did in the 80s and 90s, that led to 2016 being the first time in American history that no mine worker was killed in a roof collapse. And like, that wasn't that long ago. And like, again, just randomly choosing an example, like getting rid of measles was actually like a really big deal in American life that we didn't do until relatively recently. And that like, that's actually an incredible accomplishment of public health and government and medicine, and like not something we should be super excited to bring back. And, you know, thinking about how sort of in whatever corner of government you are, sort of the ways that your work has underpinned sort of the daily life of America relatively recently. You know, like again, FAA, you know, airplanes crashing regularly was something that happened up until pretty recently, and then it just didn't. And the fact that it didn't was actually an incredible amount of work and success. And now we have gotten, as a country, used to airplanes not crashing anymore. And like, we should not be eager to go back to an era where, for a whole variety of reasons, airplanes crash a lot. And so I think like thinking about how like the little things and the systems and the procedures and the policies that have transformed the way that we live today, I think is a great way to sort of think about stories to tell. And I now think we have added too much time
I think
to
you have done a perfect ending for the
So-
event. So a big round of applause.
Yeah.
for the
So,
two of you.
and thank you to Casey and to Max for hosting this. Casey for helping us tell these stories. Seriously, go get Furious Hours. It's an incredible book.
I was going to say,
And-
don't forget to go to the Sammys if you're not married.
Yes,
That's the
exactly.
actual
Yes.
moral of the story.
Yep.
Is
Um,
the wonderful dating service that Max is running
go,
for
exactly,
people who love this country and care about the government. Make sure to get your Sammy's ticket now.
Yeah. There's books out there if Casey is happy to sign. Max, good luck with the rest of Public Service Recognition Week.
Thank you very much for an extraordinary job and for all that you're doing, both of you. Thank you.
Where he sits on my desktop and to the point of like what people don't know, like I'm sure anybody who's worked with him thinks it's like the commodities can just in pain and yeah.